Ma'am, I said ID. Now stop playing games.
I've committed no violation. You have no lawful basis for this stop.
You're in an area known for illegal crossings, and you expect me to just assume you belong here?
I am a federal judge. You are making a catastrophic mistake.
I am a judge.
Judge Vanessa Sterling had served as a federal judge for 12 years, presiding over hundreds of cases and interpreting constitutional law with the weight of her judicial oath behind her. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, none of that mattered to the two ICE agents waiting outside her Mercedes at a Shell gas station on Riverside Boulevard. As Sterling filled her tank before heading to the courthouse, an unmarked SUV pulled up behind her, blocking her exit. Two agents stepped out wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the ICE insignia. Agent Kyle Brennan, who had spent 8 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and Agent Travis Mendoza, with 6 years of service, were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. When Sterling asked what violation justified the stop, Brennan's response was dismissive and demanding. His hand rested casually on his belt near his weapon as Mendoza circled around to peer through her car windows. Other customers at the gas station began watching the interaction, and someone pulled out their phone to record. Sterling remained composed despite the rage building inside her. She stated clearly that she was a federal judge and that this stop was unconstitutional, that the agents had no authority to detain her without reasonable suspicion of a crime. Brennan's response was contemptuous. He smirked and told her that if she was a federal judge, he was the president, then demanded her license and registration one final time. What happened next would be dissected frame by frame in federal court. Sterling slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her judicial identification, the kind issued only to sitting federal judges, complete with her photograph and the seal of the federal judiciary. She held it up clearly for Brennan to examine. He glanced at it for barely 2 seconds before handing it back with a dismissal that would cost him everything. "That doesn't mean anything," he said. "We still need to verify your immigration status." Sterling's jaw tightened as she responded with legal precision. "You just looked at federal judicial credentials and dismissed them. This is unlawful detention. I'm ordering you to step aside and let me leave." Mendoza's voice came from behind her. "You're not ordering us to do anything. We have authority under federal immigration law to conduct stops and verify status." Sterling countered with constitutional knowledge they should have possessed. "Not without individualized reasonable suspicion. You don't. And you certainly don't have authority over a sitting federal judge. This encounter is over." As Sterling moved toward her driver's door, Brennan stepped forward to block her path. His hand moved to his handcuffs. In that critical moment, Sterling made the decision that would ultimately save her but destroy both agents. She pulled out her cell phone and began recording. "I am Federal Judge Vanessa Sterling of the Northern District," she announced clearly into the phone. "I am being illegally detained by 2 agents at the Shell station on Riverside Boulevard. I have presented my credentials. I have committed no violation. I am documenting this unconstitutional stop." Mendoza's voice rose. "Turn off that phone. You're interfering with a federal investigation." Sterling's response was steady and powerful. "I am the investigation, and this recording is evidence of your constitutional violations." The situation escalated rapidly. Mendoza moved closer, his face appearing on camera as he threatened her. "Ma'am, if you don't comply right now, we will arrest you for obstruction." The absurdity of the threat hung in the air like a physical presence. 2 immigration agents were threatening to arrest a federal judge for refusing an unlawful detention. But Brennan and Mendoza weren't thinking about consequences. They were thinking about control, about authority being challenged, about a black woman who wouldn't submit to their demands. Brennan grabbed Sterling's wrist. The phone nearly dropped, but she held on with remarkable composure. Mendoza moved in from the other side, and within seconds they had forced her against her own vehicle. The phone continued recording, capturing shaky footage of the gas station pavement and the agent's boots as Sterling's voice remained steady despite the metal handcuffs closing around her wrists. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," she said. "I am a federal judge. You are committing multiple federal crimes right now." Brennan's response was chillingly dismissive. "Save it for processing." He guided her toward their SUV while other gas station customers stood frozen, watching a woman in a tailored suit being arrested at a fuel pump. 3 people were recording the scene now, and one man shouted, asking if she needed help. Mendoza told him to back away or face obstruction charges himself. The 19-minute drive to the ice field office was silent. Judge Sterling sat in the back seat, handcuffed behind her back, saying nothing. She had said everything that mattered. Now she would let the system respond, and respond it would with a force that Brennan and Mendoza couldn't begin to imagine. At the field office, they walked her inside like she was a dangerous criminal while other agents glanced over with mild curiosity. Just another person being processed. Mendoza logged her into the system with basic information: name, physical description, location of apprehension. He typed quickly, barely looking at the screen. Then came the part where they collect personal belongings, emptying Sterling's purse onto a metal table. Out came her wallet, keys, lipstick, tissues, phone, and then the items that should have stopped everything immediately. Her judicial credentials, the ones Brennan had so carelessly dismissed. Her federal courthouse access badge with its embedded security chip. Her bar association membership showing she'd been a licensed attorney for 23 years before her appointment to the bench. And a business card identifying her as Judge Vanessa Sterling, U.S. District Court. Officer Rebecca Patel, the processing agent, picked up the credentials and studied them carefully. She looked at Judge Sterling, then at Brennan and Mendoza, who were standing nearby filling out paperwork. Patel had processed thousands of people in her career, and she knew what fake credentials looked like. These weren't fake. The holographic seals, the embedded security features, the weight of the cards, everything was authentic. She opened her computer and pulled up the Federal Judiciary Directory. "What's your full name and district?" she asked Sterling. "Judge Vanessa Sterling, Northern District," Sterling replied. When Patel typed the search, the results loaded immediately. There was the photo matching the woman sitting in front of her, the biography listing her education, her appointment by the president 8 years ago, her Senate confirmation, and details about recent cases she'd presided over. Everything matched perfectly. Patel's face went pale. She stood up slowly and walked directly to her supervisor's office without knocking, simply opening the door. Her supervisor, District Director Nathan Cross, looked up annoyed at the interruption. Patel's words came out urgently. "We have a significant problem." 5 minutes later, Cross was standing in the processing area, staring at Judge Sterling. He pulled up the same federal directory on his own computer and called the courthouse to confirm she was scheduled to be in court that afternoon. He examined Brennan and Mendoza's arrest report, which listed 0 specific violations, 0 reasonable suspicion, just vague references to an immigration verification stop. Cross had been with ICE for 15 years and had navigated political controversies, policy changes, and public scrutiny. But he had never dealt with anything like this. His agents had just arrested a sitting federal judge without a warrant, without cause, without any legal justification whatsoever. His voice was quiet but sharp when he issued his command. "Release her immediately. Remove the handcuffs. Return all her belongings, and someone get me the agency's legal counsel on the phone right now." Judge Sterling stood as the handcuffs came off. She rubbed her wrist where the metal had pressed into her skin and collected her belongings methodically, checking that everything was present. Most importantly, her phone still contained the recording, 23 minutes and 14 seconds of audio capturing every word spoken during that traffic stop. Her credentials were now validated, her dignity somehow intact despite everything that had happened. Director Cross approached carefully. "Your Honor, I apologize for this incident," he said. "There's been a serious misunderstanding." Sterling's response cut through any pretense of reconciliation. "Director Cross, there was no misunderstanding. Your agents conducted an unlawful stop, ignored federal credentials, and arrested a sitting federal judge. Those are facts, not misunderstandings. We'll be conducting a full internal investigation. Sterling continued, her voice steady and resolute. You'll be facing a federal civil rights lawsuit and likely criminal charges for violating my constitutional rights under color of law. She walked toward the exit while Brennan and Mendoza stood against the wall, finally understanding that something had gone terribly wrong. Sterling paused and looked directly at them. You'll be hearing from me again in court. The door closed behind Judge Sterling with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have been. She stood outside the ICE facility in the harsh afternoon sunlight, free but fundamentally changed by what had just happened. Her phone buzzed immediately with 17 missed calls and 42 text messages from her clerk, her staff, and courthouse security, all wondering where she was. She had missed an entire afternoon of scheduled hearings, cases that mattered, people whose lives depended on her rulings, left waiting while she sat handcuffed in a processing room for the crime of existing in her own skin. She didn't call anyone back immediately. Instead, she opened the voice recording app on her phone and confirmed the file was still there, intact and complete. The recording captured everything. Every illegal question, every ignored credential, every moment of her constitutional rights being violated by federal agents who should have known better. Sterling walked to her car, still parked exactly where Brennan had forced her to leave it. A parking ticket fluttered under the windshield wiper, adding insult to the already staggering injury. She pulled it out and actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that surprised her, arrested without cause and ticketed for the privilege. The drive back to the courthouse took 30 minutes through heavy traffic, time she used to think, to plan, to shift from victim back to judge. Because that's what she was, regardless of what agents Brennan and Mendoza saw when they looked at her. She was a federal judge with the full power of the judiciary behind her, and she knew exactly how to use it. When Sterling arrived at the courthouse, the building was in controlled chaos. Her clerk practically ran to meet her at the entrance, asking urgently if she was all right and what had happened. Sterling's response was precise and commanding. Reschedule everything from this afternoon. Clear my calendar for tomorrow morning and get me the contact information for the Department of Justice, Office of Professional Responsibility, and the Inspector General for Homeland Security. Her chambers felt different when she entered, the same mahogany desk, the same leather chair, the same law books lining the walls. But she wasn't the same person who had left that morning. Something fundamental had shifted. The theoretical cases she presided over, the abstract questions of constitutional law and civil rights, weren't abstract anymore. They were personal. They were real. They were burned into her wrists where the handcuffs had been. Sterling spent the next 4 hours making calls. The first was to her husband, a college professor who listened in stunned silence as she explained what had happened. The second was to her attorney, because even judges need lawyers when their rights are violated. The third was to the chief judge of her district, because this wasn't just a personal matter. It was an assault on the judiciary itself. By 7 o'clock that evening, the machinery of justice had begun its grinding work. The Department of Justice opened a preliminary inquiry. The Inspector General's office assigned investigators. The chief judge issued a statement expressing grave concern and demanding a full accounting. And Sterling's attorney filed a notice of intent to sue, the first step toward a federal civil rights lawsuit that would cost the government far more than money. But the official response was just the beginning. The unofficial response spread through the legal community like wildfire. Judges talked to other judges. Attorneys shared the story with colleagues. Law clerks posted about it on private forums. By the next morning, every legal professional in the district knew that 2 ICE agents had arrested a sitting federal judge, and the implications were staggering. The case would expose systemic problems that reached far beyond 2 individual agents making a mistake. Meanwhile, back at the ICE facility, Director Cross was having the worst night of his career. He sat in his office reviewing the arrest report for the 100th time, searching for anything that might justify what his agents had done. There was nothing. No warrant, no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion. Just two agents who saw a black woman and decided that was sufficient reason to demand papers and make an arrest when she objected. The agency's legal counsel had been brutally clear. This case was indefensible. The agents had violated clearly established constitutional rights. Qualified immunity wouldn't protect them. The agency would likely lose any lawsuit. The only question was how much it would cost. Cross called Brennan and Mendoza into his office at 6 o'clock the next morning. Both agents arrived looking exhausted. Word had spread through the facility about exactly who they had arrested, and neither had slept well. Cross's message was direct and devastating. You're both suspended without pay effective immediately. You'll surrender your badges and firearms. You're prohibited from discussing this case with anyone except your attorneys and our investigators. Do you understand? Brennan's jaw tightened in response. This is political correctness gone crazy. We were doing our jobs, he protested. Cross's reply was cutting. Your job doesn't include arresting federal judges without cause. Your job doesn't include ignoring valid credentials. Your job doesn't include violating constitutional rights. When Brennan insisted, she showed us a fake ID. Anyone can print a card. Cross slid a printed page across the desk. It was Judge Sterling's official biography from the federal judiciary website, complete with her photo, her credentials, and her 8 years on the bench. Anyone can print a card, Cross said coldly, but not anyone can have their photo and biography on the official federal court website. Not anyone can be listed in the National Judiciary Database. You didn't check because you didn't want to believe her. Mendoza spoke for the first time, asking the question that hung over both their futures. What happens now? Cross's answer was unsparing. Now you get attorneys, good ones, because the Department of Justice is investigating you for civil rights violations under color of law. That's a federal felony. And Judge Sterling will be filing a civil lawsuit. You're both looking at criminal charges and personal financial liability. The color drained from Mendoza's face. We could go to prison, she said. Cross nodded solemnly. People have gone to prison for less egregious violations than arresting a federal judge without cause. The investigation moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. The dashboard camera from the ICE vehicle showed the entire stop. Judge Sterling's phone recording captured every conversation. The processing paperwork documented the arrest. There were no gaps, no ambiguities, no questions about what happened. Within 2 weeks, the Department of Justice made its decision. Criminal charges would be filed against both agents: deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, and abuse of authority. Each charge carried potential prison time. The civil lawsuit followed shortly after. Judge Sterling's attorney filed a comprehensive complaint in federal court nomming Brennan and Mendoza individually, nomming ICE as an agency, and nomming the Department of Homeland Security. The damages sought were substantial, but the complaint made clear this wasn't primarily about money. It was about accountability. The case was randomly assigned to another federal judge in the same district. Judge Thomas Crawford had served on the bench for 12 years and knew Judge Sterling professionally. He read the complaint with increasing disbelief, then reviewed the evidence attached as exhibits, the recordings, the video, the documented timeline. Everything confirmed exactly what the complaint alleged. He thought to himself that this would not be a long trial. It would be a settlement negotiation. He was right. The government's attorneys reviewed the same evidence and reached the same conclusion. They had no defense. Their own agents' actions were documented beyond any possibility of dispute. Going to trial would mean playing that dashboard camera footage for a jury, letting them hear 2 federal agents dismiss a judge's credentials as fake, watching them arrest her without legal justification. Settlement discussions began within a month. The government offered $500,000. Judge Sterling's attorney countered with $2.5 million, not because Sterling needed the money, but because the number had to be large enough to hurt, to force systemic change, to make sure this never happened to anyone else. The negotiations continued for weeks. Meanwhile, the criminal case moved forward on a parallel track. Brennan and Mendoza both retained private attorneys using their life savings. Both were advised to consider plea agreements because taking these charges to trial was effectively suicide. Brennan refused. He maintained he'd done nothing wrong, that he was being persecuted for enforcing immigration law. His attorney told him he was making a catastrophic mistake. Brennan fired his attorney and hired another one who told him the same thing. Mendoza was more realistic. She understood that the evidence was damning, that her career was over, that her only hope of avoiding significant prison time was cooperation. Her attorney negotiated a plea deal. Mendoza would plead guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law. She would testify against Brennan if his case went to trial. In exchange, prosecutors would recommend probation instead of prison. She took the deal. Standing in federal court, ironically just 2 floors below where Judge Sterling's chambers were located, Mendoza pleaded guilty. She admitted that she had participated in an unlawful stop and arrest. She acknowledged violating Judge Sterling's constitutional rights. She accepted responsibility for her actions. Judge Crawford, presiding over the plea hearing, asked if she understood what she was admitting. Mendoza said yes. He asked if anyone had forced or coerced her plea. She said no. He accepted the guilty plea and scheduled sentencing for 3 months later. Brennan watched all of this happen and still refused to accept reality. His new attorney begged him to reconsider, explaining that the evidence was overwhelming. His former partner had turned against him, and he was going to lose at trial and face years in federal prison. "Please," his attorney said, "take a deal while there's still time." Brennan refused. He would take his chances with a jury. He believed 12 ordinary citizens would understand he was just doing his job, just following procedures, just trying to enforce the law. His attorney knew better, but couldn't force him to see reason. Civil settlement was finally reached 4 months after the arrest. The government agreed to pay Judge Sterling $1.8 million. More importantly, they agreed to policy changes that would transform the agency. All federal agencies would implement mandatory training on implicit bias and proper identification verification. Dashboard cameras would be reviewed quarterly for constitutional violations. Agents who made unlawful stops would face immediate suspension pending investigation. The settlement terms were made public and the dollar amount made headlines. But Judge Sterling cared more about the policy changes. She wanted to prevent this from happening again to the next person, to someone who didn't have her resources or legal knowledge. The criminal trial against Brennan began 6 months after the arrest. The courtroom was packed. Local media filled the gallery. Civil rights organizations sent observers. Federal employees came to watch one of their own face justice. The prosecution's case was devastating from the opening statement. They walked the jury through every moment of that traffic stop, explaining how Judge Sterling had done nothing wrong, had presented valid credentials, had asked reasonable questions. They showed how Brennan ignored all evidence contradicting his assumptions, how he invented justifications after the fact, how he arrested a federal judge for the crime of questioning his authority. The dashboard camera footage played on large monitors for the jury. Every juror watched as Brennan dismissed Judge Sterling's credentials without even examining them properly. They heard him tell her to stop talking, to stop asking questions, to comply or face arrest. They saw him handcuff a woman who had committed no violation whatsoever. The prosecution called Mendoza as a witness. She testified for 3 hours, explaining that she had tried to tell Brennan they should verify the credentials. She admitted she should have tried harder, should have insisted, should have refused to participate. She acknowledged her own guilt, but made clear that Brennan had been the driving force behind everything that happened. Cross-examination by Brennan's attorney was brutal. He tried to paint Mendoza as a liar trying to save herself, suggesting she was the one who wanted to make the arrest and was now blaming Brennan. But the dashboard footage contradicted everything he claimed. The video showed exactly who made each decision, who gave each command, who chose escalation over verification. Expert witnesses testified about proper law enforcement procedures. A former ICE supervisor explained that Brennan had violated every protocol designed to prevent exactly this kind of mistake. A constitutional law professor walked the jury through the Fourth Amendment, explaining how Brennan's actions constituted a clear violation of Judge Sterling's rights. Judge Sterling herself took the stand. She described the humiliation of being arrested in her own vehicle. She explained how she had remained calm despite knowing she was being unlawfully detained. She recounted the fear she felt, not physical fear, but fear that anything she did or said would be used to justify violence against her. The defense tried to suggest Judge Sterling had been uncooperative, that she had escalated the situation by asking questions. Her attorney objected immediately. Asking questions is not a crime. Asserting your rights is not obstruction. The judge sustained the objection and instructed the jury to disregard the implication. Brennan took the stand in his own defense. His attorney had advised against it, but Brennan insisted. He needed to explain himself to make the jury understand. His testimony was a disaster. He claimed he had reasonable suspicion based on Judge Sterling's presence in a high-traffic area for undocumented individuals. The prosecution immediately challenged this. What high-traffic area? A residential street in a middle-class neighborhood. Be specific. Brennan couldn't provide specifics. He said Judge Sterling seemed nervous. The dashboard footage showed her perfectly calm. He claimed her credentials looked suspicious. He couldn't articulate what specifically seemed suspicious about valid federal documents. The prosecution destroyed him on cross-examination. They played the video again, pausing at key moments. When exactly did you verify these credentials before dismissing them? Brennan admitted he hadn't run them through any system. Did you call the courthouse to confirm Judge Sterling's identity? No. Did you consult a supervisor before making the arrest? No. Did Judge Sterling commit any traffic violation that justified the initial stop? A long pause. No. The prosecution pressed harder. So you stopped her based on what exactly? Brennan's response was weak. Her appearance in that area at that time. The prosecutor's follow-up was devastating. Her appearance? Yes. And what about her appearance made you suspicious? Brennan realized the trap too late. There was no answer he could give that wouldn't sound like exactly what it was: racial profiling. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on both counts: deprivation of rights under color of law and making false statements in official reports. Brennan sat motionless as the verdicts were read. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Brennan didn't react. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later. Brennan remained free on bond until then, but his life as he knew it was over. The federal conviction meant he could never work in law enforcement again. His pension was forfeit. His reputation was destroyed. Mendoza's sentencing came first. She stood before Judge Crawford, the same judge who had accepted her guilty plea. Her attorney presented letters from family and colleagues describing her years of service, her previously clean record, and her genuine remorse. Mendoza herself addressed the court, speaking directly to Judge Sterling, who sat in the gallery. She apologized for her actions, acknowledged that following orders was not an excuse, and stated that she had her own moral responsibility to refuse unlawful commands. She said she would spend the rest of her life trying to make amends. Judge Crawford sentenced her to 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a $10,000 fine. He noted that her cooperation and genuine remorse weighed heavily in his decision, but emphasized that what she did was serious, that she had betrayed her oath and violated someone's fundamental rights. Mendoza accepted the sentence without appeal. Brennan's sentencing 2 weeks later was entirely different in tone and outcome. He showed no remorse. His attorney presented a sentencing memorandum arguing that Brennan had acted in good faith, that mistakes happen in law enforcement, that prison time would be excessive. The prosecution's memorandum told a completely different story. It detailed Brennan's history of complaints, the pattern of stops targeting people of color, and the multiple warnings from supervisors that he had ignored. This was not one mistake. This was a pattern of constitutional violations that finally caught up with him. Judge Sterling submitted a powerful victim impact statement. She described the lasting effects of being treated like a criminal in her own community. She explained how she still felt anxiety during any interaction with law enforcement, how the arrest had undermined her sense of safety and belonging. She noted that as a judge, she understood the legal system better than most victims, yet still felt powerless in that moment. She asked the crucial question, what about people without my knowledge, resources, or position? How many others had Brennan violated who never got justice? Judge Crawford read the entire statement aloud in court, allowing its weight to settle over everyone present. Then he addressed Brennan directly, his words cutting and clear. You were given authority and power to serve your community. You abused that power. You targeted someone based on assumptions and bias, then arrested her when she dared to question you. Even now, after a jury convicted you, you show no understanding of what you did wrong. That concerns me deeply. The sentence was harsh and unambiguous. Brennan received 30 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release following incarceration, a $50,000 fine, and restitution to Judge Sterling for attorney fees and costs. Brennan's attorney immediately filed notice of appeal, but everyone in that courtroom knew it was futile. The evidence was overwhelming, the verdict sound, the sentence within guidelines. The appeal would fail. Brennan was taken into custody immediately. No more freedom while waiting. No more chances to flee or influence anyone. Federal marshals placed him in handcuffs and led him out of the courtroom. The same handcuffs he had placed on Judge Sterling now bound his own wrists. The symmetry was not lost on anyone present. Judge Sterling watched him leave. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just exhaustion and sadness that it had come to this, that someone entrusted with authority had abused it so thoroughly. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Judge Sterling. She made a brief but powerful statement. Justice has been served, but justice delayed is justice diminished. This should never have happened. The system failed long before that traffic stop. Multiple complaints were ignored, warning signs dismissed, patterns overlooked. Real accountability means preventing these violations, not just punishing them after the damage is done. The reporters dispersed within minutes, but the real fallout was just beginning. Within 24 hours, a civil rights organization filed a class action lawsuit against the entire police department. They had compiled records going back 7 years showing systematic patterns of racial profiling, unlawful stops, and retaliatory arrests. Judge Sterling's case wasn't unique. It was just the one that finally made headlines because of who she was. The lawsuit identified 43 other victims, each with their own story of injustice. A teacher was arrested for jaywalking after questioning why an officer stopped him. A nurse was detained for suspicious behavior while sitting in her own car outside her apartment. A college student was handcuffed for matching the description of a suspect who was 6 inches shorter and 30 pounds heavier. A grandfather was tackled during a wellness check his own daughter had requested. Every single victim was Black or Latino. Every single officer involved had complaint histories that were ignored. The patterns were undeniable once someone actually looked. But here's what made it worse. Internal Affairs had the data all along. They knew which officers generated the most complaints. They knew which precincts had the highest rates of use of force against minorities. They knew supervisors were signing off on questionable arrests without proper review. They simply chose not to act because acting would mean admitting there was a problem, and admitting problems meant liability, bad press, budget fights, and political headaches. So they buried it, filed reports in databases no one searched, marked complaints as unfounded without real investigation, and transferred problem officers to different districts instead of firing them. The system protected itself while the community suffered. The discovery process in the class action revealed emails that should never have been written. Supervisors joking about arrest quotas in certain neighborhoods. Officers sharing memes mocking people they had detained. a lieutenant telling subordinates to find reasons to stop people in high-crime areas, which was code everyone understood. The department's own training materials included outdated techniques that civil rights experts said practically encouraged constitutional violations. None of this was accidental. It was institutional rot that had been festering for decades. Judge Sterling became the face of the lawsuit, though she never wanted that role. She gave depositions, appeared at hearings, and testified before city council. Every appearance meant reliving that traffic stop, answering questions about how it felt, explaining the fear and humiliation over and over. She did it anyway because the 43 other victims deserved someone with her platform fighting alongside them. Most of them didn't have legal backgrounds. Most couldn't afford the kind of attorneys this case required. Most would have been ignored if they had tried fighting alone. The city's defense strategy was predictable and ultimately unconvincing. They claimed these were isolated incidents by officers who didn't represent department values. They pointed to diversity training programs and community outreach initiatives as proof they took these issues seriously. They argued that policing is difficult, that split-second decisions sometimes go wrong, that hindsight is 20/20. Their attorneys painted the officers as dedicated public servants who made honest mistakes under pressure. The problem was the evidence. Thousands of pages of data showing the mistakes somehow always happened to the same communities. Video footage from body cameras and dash cams showing officers lying in their reports. Testimony from sergeants admitting they approved arrests without reviewing the facts because they trusted their officers' judgment. That trust was misplaced, and now the city was paying for it. 18 months after the lawsuit was filed, the city settled. $230 million was split among the 43 victims and their attorneys. But the money was only part of the agreement. Comprehensive reforms were mandated, including independent oversight of police conduct, mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off, automatic review of any arrest where charges were dropped, and termination for officers who filed false reports. The police union fought every single reform, claiming they would make officers hesitant to act, that crime would skyrocket, that good cops would leave the force. Some did leave, most stayed. Crime didn't increase. Complaints dropped by 60% within the first year. Judge Sterling received $4.7 million from the settlement. She donated $3 million to organizations supporting criminal justice reform. She used another $1 million to establish a legal defense fund for people who couldn't afford attorneys when challenging unlawful arrests. She kept the rest, not because she needed it, but because accepting it meant the city officially acknowledged what they had done to her. The money was accountability in its most tangible form. Brennan served 22 months before being released to a halfway house. Federal prisoners typically serve 85% of their sentence if they behave well, and Brennan kept his head down. He worked in the prison library, took classes, stayed out of trouble. He never admitted guilt, never expressed genuine remorse, but he learned to say the right things during parole hearings. When he was finally released, he moved to a different state where no one knew his name or his history. He couldn't work in law enforcement anymore. His conviction made that impossible. He took a job doing private security at a warehouse, checking badges and watching cameras. The irony of a man who abused authority now working minimum wage security wasn't lost on anyone who knew his story. Mendoza had a different trajectory entirely. Her cooperation and genuine remorse opened doors that Brennan's defiance had closed. After completing probation, she became an advocate. She spoke at police academies about what she had done wrong and why. She testified before legislative committees considering reforms. She met with community groups who had every reason to hate her and answered their questions honestly, no matter how uncomfortable. Some people forgave her, many didn't. She accepted both responses as consequences she had earned. Judge Sterling returned to the bench 6 months after the settlement. Some questioned whether she could be impartial in cases involving police testimony. She proved them wrong by ruling based on evidence, not emotion. She convicted defendants when the evidence warranted it and acquitted them when it didn't. She held officers accountable when they lied and credited them when they testified truthfully. Her experience made her better at her job, not worse. She could spot inconsistencies in police reports that other judges missed. She asked questions that revealed whether an officer truly had probable cause or was justifying a hunch. Defense attorneys requested her courtroom. Prosecutors learned they needed solid cases, not just a badge and a story. 3 years after that traffic stop, a reporter asked Judge Sterling if she thought anything good had come from what happened to her. She considered the question carefully before answering. "Good isn't the word I would use," she said. "Necessary, maybe. My case forced changes that should have happened decades ago. But those changes came at a cost to me and 43 other people who never should have been violated in the first place." We shouldn't need federal judges to be unlawfully arrested before the system takes these problems seriously. We shouldn't need viral videos and lawsuits and public outrage before basic constitutional rights are protected. The fact that we do tells you everything about how broken things were. The police department still exists. Officers still make traffic stops. Arrests still happen. But the culture shifted in ways both measurable and subtle. Officers know their body cameras are recording and will be reviewed. Supervisors know signing off on bad arrests will cost them their jobs. The community knows they can file complaints that will actually be investigated. None of it is perfect. Systems created over decades don't transform overnight, but the trajectory changed, and that matters. Brennan's appeal failed as predicted. His conviction stands. His prison sentence is public record. Anyone searching his name finds the full story of what he did and what it cost him. That permanent stain is part of his punishment, a reminder that authority without accountability eventually destroys those who abuse it. Some officers learned from his example. Others resented it, viewing him as a scapegoat for systemic problems. Both reactions missed the point. Brennan wasn't a scapegoat. He was someone who violated rights repeatedly until he finally faced consequences. The system that enabled him for so long deserved scrutiny too, and it got that scrutiny through the lawsuit and reforms that followed. Judge Sterling still drives past the intersection where Brennan pulled her over. She doesn't avoid it or take alternate routes. That corner doesn't own her. She reclaimed it by refusing to let what happened there define her or limit her movements. Sometimes she thinks about that moment, the lights in her mirror, the sinking feeling in her stomach. Then she keeps driving exactly where she needs to go. That gas station on Riverside Boulevard still operates. People fill up their tanks every day, unaware of the history that unfolded on that concrete. But for Judge Sterling, for Brennan, for Mendoza, for the 43 other victims whose names never made headlines, that intersection represents something permanent. It's a reminder that badges don't grant immunity from consequences. That cameras capture truth that reports can't hide. That justice delayed is still justice when it finally arrives. The system failed repeatedly before it worked. Complaints ignored, patterns dismissed, violations rewarded with promotions instead of punishment. It took a federal judge being handcuffed at a fuel pump before anyone with power decided enough was enough. That reality should disturb everyone watching this, because it means countless others suffered without remedy, without witness, without the platform to force change. Real accountability isn't one verdict or one settlement. It's cultural transformation that makes these violations unthinkable instead of routine. Judge Sterling's case became a watershed moment for police reform, not because it was the worst violation that had occurred, but because it was the violation that finally couldn't be ignored. The combination of video evidence, the judicial platform, and the systemic investigation that followed created momentum for change. Other departments across the country used this case as a template for their own reforms. Universities taught it in legal ethics and constitutional law courses. Police academies incorporated lessons from Brennan's mistakes into their training programs. What started as one woman's courage to document her own arrest became a movement toward accountability. The case also highlighted the crucial role of documentation in the modern era. Judge Sterling's decision to record the encounter gave the justice system irrefutable evidence. The dash camera footage provided corroboration. The 3 other witnesses with their phones meant there could be no narrative control. In a world where too many cases come down to competing accounts of what happened, this case benefited from multiple forms of documentation that all told the same story. That lesson wasn't lost on civil rights organizations and community groups moving forward. Documentation became a tool for accountability, and awareness of that tool spread through communities that had historically been victimized by the system. The settlement money and reforms also demonstrated that real consequences required both individual accountability and systemic change. Brennan's conviction alone wouldn't have fixed the problem. The 43 other victims wouldn't have seen justice if Sterling had simply pursued her personal case. It took the class action lawsuit, the discovery of systemic patterns, the public exposure of internal corruption, and the mandated reforms to create lasting change. That combination, individual accountability plus systemic investigation, plus public pressure, plus institutional reform, became the model for how such cases could be handled going forward. Judge Sterling's establishment of the Legal Defense Fund was perhaps the most practical and longest-lasting legacy. By providing resources for people who couldn't afford attorneys to challenge unlawful arrests, she multiplied the impact of her own case. Every successful challenge by someone using that fund meant another person who got justice, another case that created precedent, another small shift in the balance of power between individuals and institutions. The fund became self-sustaining as successful cases attracted donations from supporters of criminal justice reform. Years after the initial traffic stop, as the immediate news cycle faded and new controversies emerged, the lasting changes remained. Quarterly dashboard camera reviews caught constitutional violations before they became lawsuits. Implicit bias training reached thousands of officers. Independent oversight meant that the old system of protecting its own could no longer operate in the shadows. Each of these reforms was built on the foundation that Judge Sterling's case had provided. Mendoza's transformation from agent to advocate also mattered in ways that went beyond her individual journey. Her willingness to testify against Brennan, to admit guilt, to work toward reform rather than defend herself, gave other officers permission to do the same. Some departments began encouraging officers who had made mistakes to participate in reform efforts rather than simply punishing them. That approach didn't work for everyone. Brennan's refusal to accept responsibility showed that some people could not be reached, but for others, it offered a path toward growth and redemption. The case ultimately became less about one traffic stop and more about what the traffic stop revealed. It exposed the machinery of injustice, the complaints that were buried, the patterns that were ignored, the supervisors who signed off on bad arrests, the unions that protected bad officers, the data systems that hid the truth, the training that enabled violations. Once that machinery became visible, the pressure to fix it became undeniable. That's what made this case transformative in a way that many other cases involving police misconduct had never been. Judge Vanessa Sterling's unlawful arrest at a gas station on Riverside Boulevard became a turning point not because she was special, though she undoubtedly was, but because her case forced the system to confront itself. The video evidence was irrefutable. The victim was credible and powerful. The systemic corruption underneath was exposed and documented. The consequences were real and visible, and the reforms that followed made actual material differences in people's lives. What happened to Agent Kyle Brennan, from decorated federal agent to minimum wage security guard with a federal conviction, was not a victory. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented. What happened to Agent Travis Mendoza, from complicit participant to advocate for reform, showed that accountability and redemption weren't mutually exclusive paths. What happened to the police department, from protected institution to reformed organization, proved that systemic change was possible, though difficult and incomplete. Most importantly, what happened to the 43 victims who filed the class action lawsuit and the countless others who never made headlines showed that individual cases matter, but only when they lead to systemic change. Judge Sterling understood this. That's why she fought not just for her own justice, but for everyone else's too. Her willingness to be the public face of reform, to relive her trauma repeatedly in depositions and courtrooms and city council meetings, extended the impact of her case far beyond herself. Years later, when people drove past that Shell gas station on Riverside Boulevard, most would have no idea of the history contained in those moments. But for those who knew the story, that intersection represented a line in the sand, before and after, the old system and the new one, the time when violations could be hidden and the time when they couldn't. Judge Vanessa Sterling didn't set out to be a symbol or a catalyst. She just set out to get justice. But in doing so, she changed a system. And that's the most important kind of victory of all.